multiply x plus 2 times x plus 3. We FOIL this, or we multiply the first terms, the outer terms, the inner terms, and then the last terms. So our first terms are going to be x and x. That's referring to the first terms in each binomial. So this term right here and this term right here, those are the first terms in each binomial. We multiply them and we get x squared. Then we're going to multiply our outer terms. So our outer terms are these two terms, x and 3x. I'm sorry, x and 3. So we multiply those, we get 3x. Then we're going to multiply our inner terms. Our inner terms, if these were our outer terms, then our inner terms are going to be 2 and x. 2 times x is 2x. Then we're going to multiply our last terms. If x and x were our first terms, our last terms would then be 2 and 3. So we'll multiply those and we'll get 6. Now we'll combine like terms and we'll get x squared plus 5x plus 6. Today we're going to learn a process called factoring. Factoring is the opposite process of FOILing or multiplying. We are going to start with x squared plus 5x plus 6, and we're going to hopefully end up with this. That's the goal for us to end up with. So we're going to create two binomials multiplied together from our trinomial right here. First thing I'm going to do is draw my parentheses. And then essentially I know that the terms that go in these two spaces, here and here, are going to need to multiply and get me x squared. And the terms that do that for me are just going to be x and x, simply enough. So I know that x goes in this first space and then x goes in this second space. Here I'm going to have two terms that are going to need to multiply and make 6, but they're going to need to add to, when this term is multiplied with this term over here, and this term is multiplied with this term right here, they're going to need to add to 5x, which is our middle term right there. So the two terms that do that for me are 2 and 3. 2 and 3 multiply to 6, and 2 times x is going to get me 2x, and 3 times x is going to get me 3x, and 2x plus 3x gets me my 5x, which is that middle term right there. And we can check our result by FOILing. When we FOIL this, we want to get what we started with up here. We want to get x squared plus 5x plus 6. If we FOIL this, or if we multiply these two binomials and we get x squared plus 5x plus 6, we did this process correctly. X times x is going to get me x squared. X times 3 will get me 3x. 2 times x will get me 2x. 2 times 3 will get me 6. When I combine like terms, I get x squared plus 5x plus 6, which is exactly what I started with. Therefore, I did this process correctly. All right, problem 2. Factor x squared minus 12x plus 20. First thing, create my two parentheses. I'm going to put my plus signs in between my sets of parentheses. Next, I'm going to see what two things multiply together to get me x squared, and I know that the only things that will do that for me are x and x. X times x is the only thing that will get me my x squared. Then I'm going to see what's going to multiply together to get me 20. Well, there's a bunch of things that can multiply together to get me 20. I know 1 times 20 is 20. Negative 1 times negative 20 is 20. 2 times 10 is 20. Negative 2 times negative 10 is 20. 4 times 5 is 20. Negative 4 times negative 5 is 20. But I know that these are the numbers that I'm going to need to fill those two blanks. Why? Alright, so those numbers are the numbers that I need in those spots, because if I multiply x and negative 10, I get negative 10x, and if I multiply negative 2 and x, I get negative 2x. And if I add those together, I end up with negative 12x, which is my middle term right here. So those are my binomials. My first binomial is x plus negative 2. My other one is x plus negative 10. We can check this to see if we did this correctly by foiling this, or by multiplying these binomials together. X times x gets me x squared. X times negative 10 gets me negative 10x. Negative 2 times x will get me negative 2x. And negative 2 times negative 10 will get me positive 20. I'll combine like terms, and I will get x squared plus negative 12x plus positive 20. This is exactly what I started with. Therefore, I know I did this process correctly. And this right here, this these two sets of binomials, is the factored form of x squared plus negative 12x plus 20. X squared plus 4x minus 12. The first thing I'm going to do is change my subtraction to plus negative, as always. I'll write my parentheses, add my plus signs, and I'm going to think about what two numbers or what two variables I'm going to multiply together to give me x squared. The only quantities or variables that will do that for me is x times x. So my first spot here and here are going to be filled with x. X times x gets me my x squared. That part's done. Next, I move on to negative 12, my last term. I'm going to list the things that multiply to get me negative 12. Negative 1 times 12 gets me negative 12. Also positive 1 times negative 12 gets me negative 12. 2 times negative 6 gets me to negative 12. Negative 2 times positive 6 gets me negative 12. 3 times negative 4 gets me negative 12. Negative 3 times positive 4 gets me 12. What will go in those two blanks? Negative 2 and positive 6 will be the numbers that go in those two blanks. The reason for this is because I also need the numbers that go into those two blanks to multiply with my x's and then add together to give me my middle term of positive 4x. These are the only numbers that will do this for us. X times 6 is positive 6x. Negative 2 times x is negative 2x. When I add those together, I get 4x, which is my middle term. Thus, I can verify that I did this correctly. All right, now for the check. Let's see if these are our correct binomials that represent the factored form of x squared plus 4x plus negative 12. I'm going to check this by foiling it, or by multiplying this binomial with this binomial. X times x will give me x squared. X times 6 will give me 6x. Negative 2 times x will give me negative 2x. Negative 2 times 6 will give me negative 12. I'm going to combine like terms, and I'll get x squared plus 4x plus negative 12, which is exactly what I started with. Therefore, I know that I did this correctly, and I know that x plus negative 2 times x plus 6 is the factored form of x squared plus 4x plus negative 12. X squared minus 5x minus 14. Change my subtraction to plus negative. Make my parentheses. Fill in my plus signs. X and x are the numbers that multiply together to get me x squared. Negative 1 times 14 will get me negative 14. 1 times negative 14 will get me negative 14. 2 times negative 7 will get me negative 14. Negative 2 times positive 7 will get me negative 14. But 2 and negative 7 are going to be my numbers that go in the parentheses. I can verify that by multiplying x and negative 7 and 2 and x. When I add these together, I get negative 5x, which is my middle term. I'm going to check this to make sure that these two binomials represent the factored form of x squared plus negative 5x plus negative 14. And I'm going to check it by multiplying those two binomials. X times x will give me x squared. X times negative 7 will give me negative 7x. 2 times x will give me positive 2x, and 2 times negative 7 will give me negative 14. I'm going to combine like terms, and I'll get x squared plus negative 5x plus negative 14. This is the exact thing I started with, therefore I know that x plus 2 times x plus negative 7 is the factored form of x squared plus negative 5x plus negative 14. X squared minus 17x plus 30. First thing I'm going to do, change subtraction to plus negative. Draw my parentheses. Insert my plus signs. Decide which two numbers are going to multiply together to get me x squared. That will be x and x. Those will go in my first set of blanks, because x times x gets me x squared. Then I'm going to think of the numbers that multiply together to get me positive 30. The numbers that multiply together to get me positive 30 are these. And the numbers that I'm going to insert into my binomials are negative 2 and negative 15. The reason for this is because x times negative 15 will get me negative 15x, and negative 2 times x will get me negative 2x. And when I add them together, I'll get negative 17x, which is my middle term. To verify that those are my two correct binomials, I'm going to check by multiplying those two binomials. X times x gets me x squared. X times negative 15 will get me negative 15x. Negative 2 times x will get me negative 2x. And negative 2 times negative 15 will get me positive 30. When I combine like terms, I'll get x squared plus negative 17 plus 30. And that's exactly what I started with. Therefore, I know that x plus negative 2 times x plus negative 15 is the correct factored form of x squared plus negative 17x plus 30. Factor x squared plus x plus negative 12. Here I'm going to change the negative 12 to plus negative, and I'm going to put a 1 in front of my x. Draw my parentheses. Insert my plus signs. Decide what two quantities multiply to get me x squared. That's going to be x and x, because x times x is x squared. Decide what numbers multiply to negative 12. Those are the sets of numbers that multiply to negative 12. The numbers that I will choose are negative 3 and positive 4. The reason for this is because when I multiply x and 4, I get 4x, and negative 3 and x, I get negative 3x. When I add those together, I get positive 1x, which is my middle term. I'm going to check that x plus negative 3 times x plus 4 is my correct set of binomials that represent the factored form of x squared plus 1x plus negative 12 by multiplying those binomials together. X times x gets me x squared. X times 4 gets me 4x. Negative 3 times x gets me negative 3x. Negative 3 times 4 gets me negative 12. I'm going to combine like terms, and I'll get x squared plus 1x plus negative 12. That's exactly what I started with. Therefore, I know that x plus negative 3 times x plus 4 is the correct factored form of x squared plus 1x plus negative 12. Try these two. All right, now go ahead and start your independent practice. You'll turn this into the bin when finished. Then you will complete all of your Khan Academy Mastery challenges. After this, you will start your homework. If you finish all of this, or if you want before you start your homework, you can do an extra credit Khan objective. This extra credit objective is called Factoring Quadratics 1.